It's coming to the end of the night at a busy bar in Arizona. The pretty woman behind the bar announces it's closing time, much to the annoyance of all the folks who want to keep on drinking. Two guys are down in beers while enjoying a game of darts. One of them in the near future will be handed a death sentence. The reason is because when that woman locked up for the night, she was murdered. Her body was found the next morning in a restroom cubicle. She'd been stabbed multiple times and there were bite marks on her body. This horrific crime shocked the community. Who could have done such a thing? Well, the cops thought it might well have been one of the guys in the bar that night. Before we get to why this darts lover survived death row, you need to know more about the crime and how investigators and the justice system itself really messed up. On the morning of the 29th of December 1991, the owner of the CBS Lounge in Phoenix, Arizona had the fright of his life. He'd opened up the lounge and was going about his duties when he entered the restrooms. In one of the cubicles, he saw the naked and mutilated body of his bartender, one Kim Arcona. The investigators didn't have much evidence. What they did have was some saliva found on the victim's body, and they also noticed that the bite marks were weird, as if the killer had snaggle teeth. There was no DNA evidence back then, but the cops could match the saliva to a blood type. The problem with that was the saliva came from the most common blood type. The cops then got a break because while conducting interviews, they were told by one person that a guy usually helped Kim clean up after the place was closed. He was a regular customer, and as we said, he was fond of throwing darts. The cops were told that this guy was called Ray Croney. They jumped on this since he could have been the last guy in the lounge that night. The cops interviewed Croney, and Croney said he had nothing to do with the crime. He was disgusted that they could think he was capable of doing such a thing. He said he went right home after the bar closed, and his roommate confirmed it. One of the cops then noticed that Croney had some weird-looking front teeth. And since the bite marks looked strange, they asked Croney to provide a styrofoam impression of his teeth. "Of course I will," Croney said, knowing full well he was an innocent man. The police didn't think so, and on December 31st, 1991, Mr. Croney was arrested and charged with murder, kidnapping, and sexual assault. In 1992, a so-called expert stood up in court and said Croney's teeth matched the bite marks. Seriously, was that enough to get a conviction even though Croney had an alibi as to where he was at the time of the crime? The jury thought it was good enough, and they found him guilty. It was a wrap. The forensic odontologist that the prosecution had hired looked the jury in the eye and said there was absolutely no doubt that only Croney's very unique teeth could have caused those marks. As for the defense, well, they didn't have a forensic odontologist of their own to debunk what the prosecution said. And get this, the reason that expert said there was no doubt that the bite marks came from Croney was because at the time it was thought that every person had an individual bite impression. A paper published in 1984 said there was statistical evidence for the individuality of human dentition. The person who wrote that paper, though, was the expert for the prosecution. The paper was said to be very much flawed by other forensic odontologists, and they said no way should it ever be used in a legal case. Well, it was used by the man who wrote it. Maybe he had something to prove. Croney was convicted of murder and kidnapping and sentenced to death. We should say that he wasn't found guilty of sexual assault. Just for a moment, imagine how you would feel if you got the death sentence and you were innocent. Can you imagine the mental anguish? What about your friends and family and neighbors thinking you were a crazed maniac capable of killing a woman? How would you feel knowing that people called you the snaggletooth killer? And we aren't kidding. It was an expert bite mark testimony that was the main evidence. That and the fact that Croney had been in the bar that night. Not surprisingly, a number of people thought Croney was innocent. In 1996, he was granted a retrial. The weird thing is, the judge actually admitted that there were doubts regarding if Croney had done the deed, but he didn't free him. Nope, he merely reduced Croney's sentence to a life sentence. This is what the judge said. The court is left with a residual or lingering doubt about the clear identity of the killer. This is one of those cases that will haunt me for the rest of my life, wondering whether I've done the right thing. Well, Judge James McDougal, your nightmare would come true because Croney was indeed very much an innocent man. In 2002, we had something called DNA evidence, and that showed us with certainty that Croney was not the killer. He'd been on death row and served 10 years behind bars, and finally he was freed with the help of an attorney named Alan Simpson. The saliva came from a man named Kenneth Phillips. He was a guy who had been convicted of sexual assaults in the past, and we're talking about a long rap sheet. He lived just 600 yards from that lounge, although he was never even investigated. At the time when the DNA evidence pointed to him, he was already behind bars for the sexual assault of a child. He would eventually be convicted of the crime of killing Kim Arcona. In hindsight, the evidence that the cops had from the crime scene to the many interviews with people should have pointed to Phillips. In fact, it's plain crazy that they didn't even talk to Phillips. Police and the prosecution just ignored all the evidence. They had their bite mark, and that seemed it was enough. You should also know that Crony had no criminal record at all and certainly wasn't seen as a violent man. He was well-liked, worked in the post office, and had been honorably discharged from the military. And just down the street from the crime scene there lived a man whose trademark crimes were all over that assault and murder. This is what Crony said when he got out. "I would not trust the state to execute a person for committing a crime against another person. I know how the system works." He now spends his life campaigning for the abolition of the death penalty and dedicates his time to trying to reform the criminal justice system. In 2005, he was compensated $1.4 million from Maricopa County and a further $3 million from the city of Phoenix. Crony wrote on Reddit in 2015, "Any chance I can, whether I start with one or two people or a whole auditorium filled with people, I tell them what happened to me. Because if it happened to me, it can happen to anyone." He was asked a lot of questions, with the obvious one being, "How do you feel when you're found guilty?" Crony answered, "The horrors of being thrown into another world, another universe that is no longer understandable. The helplessness overwhelms you with nowhere to turn. The system exerts its full force on you." He said the justice system isn't about justice, it's about winning. He also said there were 5 things he was looking forward to all the time he was in prison and hoping he'd got justice. They were being able to hug my mom and sister, good food, being able to walk barefoot in the grass, riding a motorcycle, driving a car. He said he forgives those who put him away because he doesn't want anger to spoil his freedom. Those who sent him away will have to live with what they did all their life, said Crony. At the time of his release, Crony was the 12th man to be found innocent and exonerated from death row. As of November 2019, there have been 166 death row exonerations in the USA. In the US in total, there have been 365 DNA exonerations for serious crimes, with the average time being spent behind bars being 14 years. 10% of innocent people spent 25 years locked up. Believe it or not, some of those people had confessed and pled guilty even though they didn't commit the crime. There have been many studies, but most of them say that in the US between 2.3 and 5% of all prisoners are innocent. Another study suggests 4.1% of death row inmates are innocent. Researchers have said that 340 men since 1973 were put to death, but probably were innocent. They came up with that after a team of lawyers and statisticians analyzed data of 7,482 defendants who were handed the death sentence between 1973 and 2004. That's the end of the show, and we think you need to hear a bit more about injustice. So take a look at this shocking video, why prisoner proven innocent can't be released.